All right. Hi, everybody. Hello, online people, and hello, in-store people. My name is Erik Arneson, and today I'm going to be teaching this class called Searching for the Hermetic Keys, which is going to be an introduction to Hermeticism and Hermetic philosophy. So first of all, I've been studying tarot and the occult since the 80s, practicing ceremonial magic for a long time. I should have rewritten this slide so it focused on why I should be talking about Hermeticism. So I will talk about that instead. You can read the slide and be like, ooh, Erik is very nerdy. In the early 2000s, I came across The Way of Hermes, which is a translation of the Corpus Hermeticum by Clement Solomon and some other scholars. And while reading it, had that sort of experience that you hear born-again Christians talk about, where it kind of makes you gag a little bit. I kind of had that experience while reading the Corpus Hermeticum, and it led me into this just sort of rabbit hole of study of this like very, very old and frankly twice extinct philosophy, religion sort of thing, and I've just kind of been in love with it ever since. So that's why I'm here talking about it. And this is what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the history of Hermeticism. We're going to talk about what it means for something to be Hermetic, which will hopefully help us understand what is and is not Hermetic, or how something can be considered to be Hermetic. And then we're going to talk about modern day practice of Hermeticism and what that looks like, and why it might be a little bit different than you expect. So Hermeticism is pretty old. We've got to go back in time a long ways to history's most handsome bad guy, Alexander the Great. He spread across, the entire Middle East and Europe and Asia in the 4th century BCE, and just did a lot of conquering. And one of the areas he conquered was Egypt. After his untimely death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, took over the government of Egypt, took over governing in Egypt, and had a long line of basically like pharaohs of Greek descent named after him. All the Ptolemies up until basically Rome got tired of them. So in the 4th century, this happened, and it led to sort of like a Hellenization of Egyptian culture, where there was a big influx of Greek culture and Greek people. There was a lot of sort of like syncretization of not only the culture, but also the religion. And it ended up sort of changing the way religion worked in Egypt in such a way that like it made whole new gods. And these gods tended to be kind of blends of earlier gods. Hermenubis is one that I really like. Serapis, which was a combination of like Amun and Zeus, I believe. But then there were lots of others. So Greek religion got imported into Egypt and started changing things. But at the same time, Egyptian religion got exported across the Mediterranean and ended up in all sorts of interesting places. Like there was a massive temple of Isis in Rome, for instance. Alexander also founded a bunch of cities, and every single one of them was named Alexandria. And we still keep naming cities Alexandria, which I think is a little baffling. There's a Alexandria right next to Washington, D.C. There's an Alexandria in Minnesota that has a great Viking statue, if you're ever on that part of the country. But the Alexandria in Egypt, which still exists today, was home to the Library of Alexandria, and ended up being like this incredible cultural melting pot where there were people from all over the Mediterranean world who ended up there and ended up sharing ideas and all that kind of stuff. Hermeticism isn't necessarily from Alexandria, but it's through that spirit of Alexandria that it really started to happen. And of course, when people think about Hermeticism, the first name that really comes to mind is Hermes Trismegistus, or Trismegistus. Who knows how you're supposed to say it? I will probably say Hermes Trismegistus, but if you want to say it the other way, you're good too. There's nobody around to police that anymore. So he probably wasn't a real person. He was probably sort of a sort of like mythical author, legendary author that people would just ascribe texts to. That was very common back then. He seems to have been probably like very heavily influenced, or maybe even a blend of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. Both of these gods were responsible for writing and magic and had a lot of things in common, and it made a lot of sense to sort of smoosh them together. The Trismegistus part means thrice greatest in Greek, and it was sort of a like an extra special honorific that was sort of saying like this Hermes character is extra, extra, extra cool. He ended up becoming so legendary that he's sort of like a really central mythical figure in both in Renaissance and esotericism and in modern Western occultism. So it's good to know his name, and it's good to know that he probably wasn't real, and it's good to know that, you know, sometime in the Renaissance he started being depicted with this pointy hat all the time. So I guess that's kind of his thing, if you like pointy hats. But as we'll talk about hopefully if you haven't read any of the Hermetica after this, you'll be inspired to do so. And Hermes Trismegistus isn't actually the only character in the Hermetica. Especially in the core texts, there are these three other fun characters. One of them, Tat, is the son of Hermes Trismegistus. And a good chunk of the Hermetic literature is about Hermes teaching Tat of the ways of Hermeticism and the ways of his philosophy, and leading him through initiations and leading him into this like mystical experience. Asclepius shows up a lot. Asclepius is the Greek god of medicine. I'm not entirely sure why he's in Hermetic literature so much, but one of our main Hermetic texts is called the Asclepius. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Asclepius himself, like the worship of Asclepius during this time when Hermeticism was first coming around, was really fascinating. His priests would set up these temples, and basically you would go there and the priests would sort of like talk to you about what was wrong with you, and then you would sleep and you would have a dream and wake up, and the priests would help interpret the dream and give you like medical advice. It was an interesting practice. But he shows up in the Hermetica as one of the students of Hermes. And then finally, in some of the texts, there's a character called King Ammon, who possibly is the Egyptian god Amun, but it's a little hazy. He seems to just be a god or a king. And in some of the texts, he's receiving instructions from Tat. So it's almost like he's the third generation of Hermetic initiates, where Hermes teaches Tat, and then Tat goes and teaches King Ammon about the Hermetic practices. So I've mentioned the Hermetic texts a number of times, and these are sort of like the basis of what forms Hermetic philosophy and Hermetic practice. They're basically called the Hermetica. They probably date back to about the 1st century BCE, but we don't know for sure. But somewhere around there is when they were probably first written down. And then the most recent ones are probably like maybe at the latest the 8th century CE. But again, it's tough to know exactly when. But they're old. You know, they're old, but not staggeringly old. Or maybe they're staggeringly old, but not ludicrously old. But they're mostly younger than Christianity. They're mostly younger than the Bible. They are definitely much younger than like ancient Egypt and Egyptian religion, and they are mostly really short. Like you can see this little book here, The Way of Hermes. This is a complete translation of the Corpus Hermetica, the main text, and it's tiny. There's not a lot of it. So the Corpus Hermeticum, this is these days probably the most well-known collection of Hermetic texts. It's 17 different texts that were written in Koine Greek. It introduces all of those characters that I mentioned earlier. So Hermes Trismegistus is in it, and Tat and Asclepius and King Ammon. and it's not very technical. And what I mean by that is it talks about the philosophy and the sort of like religious vision of Hermeticism, but it doesn't really give you any details on what to do with it. You know, so it'll talk about like, you know, here's a mystical creation story. Here's a list of you know, virtues that you need to practice. Here are some spiritual challenges you will have. Here's what you can do with your mind if you use it right. But then it doesn't tell you like how. But it's an incredible book. It's definitely worth reading, and there are a number of translations that are available today. I'll talk about those in a little bit. The second most important Hermetic text is the Asclepius, and this dates back to probably the 1st to 3rd century, and was originally in Greek, although we don't have all of the original Greek. We just have like parts of it. The oldest original stuff we have from the Asclepius is in Latin. This book was really, really influential for a very long time because it was kind of like the primary Hermetic text that existed for Europe up until the 1400s. It's got a lot of really interesting stuff in it, including these pieces about ensouling statues and like the nature of what makes something alive and what makes something have a soul. You know, like if anything moves under its own power or moves of its own volition, it is considered ensouled. It also has the prophecy of Hermes Trismegistus, which was probably written after all the stuff that he prophesied actually happened, where he talks about how in the future nobody will speak the language of Egypt anymore. Everyone will speak this degenerate language of the Greeks. But of course, the original was written in Greek. So, and then finally, the Asclepius, which the whole thing is sort of laid out as a lesson of Hermes to, I think everybody's there. I think it's Tat and Asclepius and King Ammon are all with them, and they're like hanging out in the cave. Hermes is giving them this lesson, and then at the end they go outside, and Hermes teaches them this beautiful prayer of thanksgiving, and then it's like, all right, now let's eat, and then the book ends. It's a really good one. It's also worth reading. And then another collection we have, they're basically just fragments of Hermetic texts. A lot of these are preserved in quotes in other books. So like the Stobaeus fragments are all in like letters he left for his son or letters he wrote for his son, where he's like, if you want to, you know, grow up to be a real man, follow Hermes Trismegistus, who said blah, 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 blah. So we have a lot of little quotes like that. We have fragments of papyri that have things on them. We have some fragmentary parts from some fragmentary Hermetic texts in the Nag Hammadi documents. If you guys don't know what those are, they are some really weird. Are they weird? I mean, they're weird. They're basically the oldest stuff we have about Gnostic Christianity. They were found in a jar in the desert by a goat herd in 1950, and they've been really influential since then. But some of the stuff in there is Hermetic. Like there's part of the Asclepius is in there, and there's a longer Hermetic piece called the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, or the cooler name, the Ogdoad Reveals the Ennead, which I think is it's a cool name. But also a lot of your favorite old classical philosophers, early church fathers, writers from late antiquity, all have quotes from Hermes Trismegistus or writings that were supposed to be part of Hermes Trismegistus. And I can't remember which one of the. There was an early philosopher in this era who said that there were like 42 books attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and then I think somebody else was like, "Oh no, there's 42,000." But so we have a lot of lost Hermetica. There's a lot of stuff that just has faded and didn't make it out of Egypt or out of the Mediterranean or out of the 3rd century or whatever. Another class of Hermetic texts are the technical Hermetica, and these are books that are kind of possibly more akin to what you would think of when you're thinking about Hermeticism. If you don't know what it is, like stuff about astrology and alchemy and magic. And I'm not going to talk about these a whole lot, primarily because I'm not super familiar with the astrological and alchemical technical Hermetica, but I will talk a little bit more about the PGM in a little bit. But there's a lot of these, and you'll sometimes, I'm not really sure how strict people are when they talk about what's technical Hermetica and what isn't. But if you are reading an old book like some sort of ancient Greek text on astronomy, and it's like, oh yes, and Hermes Trismegistus says blah 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 blah, that probably counts as technical Hermetica. Another writing that people are probably familiar with is the Emerald Tablet. This is a really late piece of Hermetica that possibly dates back to the 7th century. It's become extremely influential. Like, people love this text. It's really not very long. It's like, I don't know, 300 words, 250 words. And it contains this strange, supposedly an alchemical allegory. There's a really famous translation by Isaac Newton, and it's also where we get the as above, so below phrase. Like, that comes from the Emerald Tablet. And it's part of what brings alchemy into the fold of Hermeticism. And then another text. This is a really good one too. The definitions of Hermes Trismegistus were, strangely enough, preserved in Armenian. The original probably dates back to the 6th century. The only English translation is In the Way of Hermes. This is also a very short text, but it's basically Hermes talking to Tat and having all of these like Hermetic aphorisms that talk about basically like the things that Hermeticism is there to teach you. How to have knowledge of the divine, how to speak well, how to develop like the sort of like cosmic part of your mind, or nous. And it's a good read. I haven't spent a whole lot of time with it, but it's every time I do flip through it, it's fun. And then finally, of course, there are modern books that claim to be Hermetic, but aren't really. So we won't talk very much about the Chameleon except to make fun of it in this talk. So sorry about that. Okay, so when we talk about Hermetic texts or Hermeticism, what makes it Hermetic? And honestly, like, it's old. It's really old, and it's kind of hard to understand because it's old, and it's people writing in languages that nobody speaks anymore about difficult topics like mysticism and philosophy and magical practice that make it like it's the sort of books. It's the texts are the sort of things that you can like really, really enjoy while you're reading them, because some of them are visionary and some of them are really delightful. But in order to understand them, you have to sit with them and spend time with them and realize that nobody else is doing the same thing you're doing. So a lot of your interpretations and a lot of your understanding will probably be very subjective. And especially since very few Hermetic texts agree with each other. One of the things that you'll discover in the Corpus Hermeticum, for instance, the core texts, is that like they don't really agree on like the nature of the divine or the nature of the cosmos. There are multiple stories of creation. There are multiple stories of what you're supposed to be doing, or the way you're supposed to act, or how your relationship with God is supposed to be, or how your relationship with the divine is supposed to work. And different scholars have different interpretations of this. Sometimes they're like, oh, it was because you were going through initiations, and at each level they'd be like, oh, here's the real answer. And then other people are like, maybe there was no such thing as Hermeticism, and these books just all got collected together at some point. So, and honestly, we don't know, but we do know that it's old. And we do know that it's a weird mix-up of Greek and Egyptian religion. So if you want to study Hermeticism, what should you study? I think that the only real answer, the only thing to really start with, is read the Corpus Hermeticum. It's not big. Take notes on it. find things that don't make sense, ask questions, find other Hermeticists and talk to them about it, and try to puzzle out exactly what the message is that's coming through those things. There's a saying that that Hermeticism is made up of three different studies, and those are alchemy, astrology, and magic. And a lot of times, I think the magic is sort of supposed to be theurgy, which is God working or divine working. I'll talk about that a little later. But all of these things were extremely influential in Western culture, in fact, like across the world in various forms. But alchemy is, everybody knows about alchemy. It's turning base metals into gold. Jung sort of reframed it as this way of reaching of like spiritual alchemy, but it's unclear how prevalent that idea of spiritual alchemy was all the time through the past. Alchemy sort of really latched onto the Emerald Tablet, which so the as above, so below thing is part of alchemy. The Philosopher's Stone is kind of like the ultimate goal in alchemy, and it's always a little unclear on what that's supposed to be. Sometimes the Philosopher's Stone seems to be something that is used to turn base metals into gold. Sometimes it seems to be some sort of, universal Orvietan for healing all diseases and curing all ills. Sometimes it's interpreted as a way to achieve some sort of immortality. I myself have never done a lot of alchemy. I feel like I don't need any more lead exposure. I was born in the 70s, so But alchemy is definitely one of the things that you can really dive into. There are some really interesting and extensive schools of modern alchemy that you can explore that involve plant medicine or even the metal stuff. So, but I haven't done any of that. I'm always fascinated by the people who have. Astrology. So when we talk about astrology and Hermeticism, we're not just talking about the fortune-telling portion of it. We're talking about the way astrology sort of allows one to understand and explore the celestial machine, the interconnectedness of all things, the way that the movements of the sky mirror the movements on Earth, the way that and also like the way that the movements of the sky sort of mirror sort of like the will of the gods and the influence of the gods. I'll be talking about this on the next slide, actually, but like a big part of the Hermetic practice seems to be a way of initiating yourself or going through a transformative process so that you can ascend, so that your soul can ascend through like the heavenly spheres, so that the celestial movements no longer confine you or control what you're doing. So that portion of astrology is kind of what is I think most important in Hermeticism. But we'll see. Again, I use the as above, so below thing because it shows up so often in Hermeticism. There's just there's this idea of a continuity of creation that is just sort of interconnected, where everything is like interlocked and interconnected. And then the third thing, magic, in particular theurgy. These are like ritual practices that are intended to help you purify parts of your soul or perfect parts of your soul so that you can kind of ascend into the heavens. And we don't, like I said, there aren't a lot of technical Hermetic pieces that talk about this, but we do have theurgic practices that were primarily developed by the Neoplatonists, and I've got a few Neoplatonists down there. I think Iamblichus is the one who's got the most theurgy in him or in his work, and I'll mention some books later on that talk about theurgic practices. But these are basically, this is sort of like when you learn magic and you learn, like, especially like modern Golden Dawn magic, and you're like, oh yes, here's the middle pillar ritual. It won't do anything magical, but it will align your soul with the tree of life and all that kind of stuff. That's theurgy, All right, so let's see. Okay, so let's talk about some of the themes in Hermeticism. Mainly because, like, as we get into this and we talk about Hermeticism in the modern world, we will discover that the term Hermetic gets really watered down in the 1800s, and it gets hard to sort of determine what people mean in the modern world when they say Hermetic. So we're going to look at some of the themes in Hermetic texts um, and how to spot those in modern works, so you can see, like, oh yes, this book claims to be Hermetic, and it actually is talking about Hermetic things. Um, so so there is sort of like this idea of a divine nature, not just to the entirety of creation, but embedded in the human experience, in sort of like this idea of each individual human being a portion or a reflection of a godlike human that is supposed to be responsible for taking care of creation. There's another thing. Hermeticism seems to sometimes feel like sometimes it sort of seems to indicate that there is a process of rebirth or reincarnation. Of course, it would be Greek, so it's metempsychosis, where you have to sort of like finish perfecting your soul before you can kind of like ascend and escape sort of like the bounds of fate and destiny. Again, there's the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm. There's this strange idea of mind in Hermeticism, where mind is sort of like put above all the other layers of the soul and all the other layers of what it means to be a person, where our own mind, our own nous, sort of is a reflection of the divine, and that's a very important part of it. There's also God in Hermeticism is both transcendent and immanent, but also there are lesser gods, lots of them possibly. And then another thing, the first book in Corpus Hermeticum is a moment of divine revelation where the nous of God comes down and talks to somebody and is like, here's a vision of how creation happens, and here's your role in it. So divine revelation is kind of central to a lot of elements in Hermeticism. So those are sort of like the beginning parts of the themes. So the human soul is sort of split up into parts. You'll see this. So Hermeticism is old, and parts of Hermeticism were influenced by Neoplatonism and probably cross-pollinated a lot with Christian Gnosticism. But some of the stuff also ended up later becoming parts of other mystical traditions. So there's some of the stuff in here that always makes me think of Kabbalah. But the soul kind of has layers, where the lowest layer, the psyche, is like the individual consciousness. The pneuma is sort of like the motion between the psyche and the nous, and then the nous is sort of your highest attainable faculty that you might not have access to when you begin, but as you start to work, as you start to sort of like go through a purification process, you learn more and more to be in your nous, or to utilize the nous. And the Corpus Hermeticum promises a great number of amazing magical powers and the ability to see visions from far away and travel through, the astral plane or whatever, using your nous. God is in the Corpus Hermeticum, or at least the God, the Creator, is very distant and kind of unreachable in some way. Exists beyond the planetary spheres, is sort of ineffable, but then at the same time sometimes described as sort of like immanent and transcendent. So in a way, the Hermetic God is like a panentheist God, where God is both here and everywhere else in the universe, and then also beyond the universe. And in various Hermetic texts, this is sort of treated differently, but like one of the most interesting things is in the Asclepius when it talks about praying to God. It's like when you pray to the God, you don't give offerings, you don't burn incense. The only offering is your words and your prayer. It's only when you pray to the gods that are reachable that you burn incense, that you give sacrifices, that you do all this sort of stuff. And when God does interact with anybody in the Corpus Hermeticum, it's usually the nous of God, the poimandres, who shows up and gives messages and stuff. Creation is sort of it's very emanatory in Hermeticism, like God, creation sort of flows forth from God, possibly constantly, like it does in Kabbalah. I'm not really sure, but you'll find multiple creation stories. The one in the first book of the Corpus Hermeticum, God creates nature and man, and nature is sort of given the world or becomes the world, and man falls in love with nature and is like, I'm going down there to take care of it. So that's like part of the sort of Hermetic creation story. Again, like because of this, the material world is a reflection of the divine world, and that is sort of where the as above, so below thing happens. You know, since creation is coming forth from God, it is of course part of Him and reflects His nature. The seven celestial spheres, like this is very, very, Western religion at the time, Western cosmology. Like, there are the crystal spheres that surround us, consisting of the 7 planets. Each one of those spheres is, of course, governed and ruled by a god. That god controls various virtues and is hindered by various vices, and you need to overcome those vices to sort of like ascend through them. And then the fact that like the divine human decided to go down into nature to sort of like love it and take care of it means that we are all part of like somehow the same divine being trapped in mortal form. Something. Like a carton of eggs. And someday we're all just going to be one big omelet. And of course, the ultimate goal, as I was just saying, is to ascend through the celestial spheres and return creation to the divine source. So those are sort of like the core themes in the philosophical Hermetica and sort of the like religious basis of Hermeticism. And now we're going to take a break from the difficult stuff and get into a little bit more history, because Hermeticism kind of vanished from the Western world. I don't think anybody really knows why, but there was a lot of turmoil and change in late antiquity. The Roman Empire started to collapse. Christianity rose. Islam rose. War continued. People seemed to sort of like organized religion got more developed and turned into more of a thing. There was a lot of work to sort of like stamp out heretical lines of Christianity very early on, and maybe Hermeticism got tied up with that. But also the Egyptian religion kind of fizzled out. Our last demotic writings were in like the 4th century, and nobody was doing Egyptian gods anymore, and maybe the Hermeticism just sort of faded away along with the Greek and Egyptian religious traditions. But the Hermetic texts, though they were lost in the Latin world and lost in the Greek world, did manage to continue in the Arabic world. And we do have like the Emerald Tablet, which was, I think, first translated in Arabic. We have some Greek texts that were maintained in like Arabic libraries. We have a possible colony of Hermetic pagans who lived in the Middle East in Haran, but I don't know how much we actually know about them. And then we have what I've seen described as like the Germanic Hermetica, which would be the Emerald Tablet and the Asclepius, the books that sort of continued, made their way into Northern Europe and turned into sort of the alchemical tradition that we all know with all of its beautiful pictures and obscure writings. But all of that was bound to change in the Renaissance. In 1460, Cosimo de' Medici acquired Greek manuscripts of the Corpus Hermeticum, and Marsilio Ficino immediately stopped his, those dates might not be right, but Marsilio Ficino stopped his work on translating Plato and began working on translating the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin before Cosimo died, so that Cosimo would get a chance to read them. By this time, by the Renaissance, the name Hermes Trismegistus was like legendary and mythical in like a really exciting way, right? Like people had heard about them, you know, Hermes Trismegistus and his 42,000 books, or Hermes Trismegistus and his, you know, perennial wisdom or whatever, but nobody could find anything that was written by him. So when the de Medicis finally got books that claimed to be written by Hermes Trismegistus, Ficino was like, oh, he's supposed to be like the smartest person ever. I better translate those first. So he did, and that was the first introduction of the Corpus Hermeticum into Europe, into the Latin-speaking world.
Question.
Yes.
Do you think Muslims were more tolerant of Hermetic ideas than Christians? Maybe something with Muslim of Egypt, or could it have factored into Sufism?
That's a good question. I don't know enough about Sufism to comment on all of that, but I will say that there is an old legend that so in the Quran there's a piece that says like people of the book are to be sort of like respected or left alone, and then it lists like, you know, what are the people of the book, and it has sort of these categories, and one of them nobody could figure out what it was, and so supposedly the pagans of Haran, when you know the Muslim armies sort of like marched in there, is like, everybody, you have to you know, convert or get killed. They were like, no, don't worry, we're people of the book, and this is our book, and this is it. So it's possible that they got left alone, but I don't know. That might just be a story, but that's sort of what I've heard.
Also, do we know the names of the?
I don't. Somebody might. Yeah, I don't know the names of the Arabic translators. But anyhow, at this time, Hermes Trismegistus still being sort of this legendary figure, it was thought that he was very, very old, that he predated Moses and was possibly a teacher of Moses. But the Hermetica at this time, they did start to have a really big influence among all of our favorite Renaissance weirdos, including Pico della Mirandola, who sort of integrated Hermeticism with this brand new Christian Kabbalah that he was developing, but also integrated it into his lectures and works. You know, he quotes the Hermetica in his famous orations. The Oration on the Dignity of Man starts off with a Hermetic quote. As the Renaissance developed, we started to get more and more cool people getting interested in Hermeticism. There's a theory put forth by Dame Frances Yates that the Corpus Hermeticum and the translation of the Corpus Hermeticum was basically what drove the Renaissance. And that theory has been sort of batted back and forth, and I'm not sure how seriously it's taken anymore, but for a long time it was sort of like, oh yeah, we wouldn't have had the Renaissance if it wasn't for the Corpus Hermeticum. But we had Ludovico Lazzarelli, who wrote Crater Hermes, or the Bowl of Hermes, Hermetis, and he was the first person to call himself a Hermeticist. There's Agrippa, of course, who wrote about Hermes Trismegistus, but also quoted him a little bit in De Occulta Philosophia. Paracelsus, John Dee, my favorite, Giordano Bruno, who was into the Hermetic philosophy and also practiced the art of memory. So the Renaissance really sort of flourished with all of these like people exploring, I don't know, alternative philosophies and alternative religions, and finding really cool ways to mix Hermeticism with other things, which probably in retrospect was a bad idea, but it was cool at the time. And then it all came crashing down. In 1614, this scholar, Isaac Casaubon, started developing this, this method of textual analysis where he was able to look at old texts and figure out when they were actually written by comparing them to other old texts. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to us now, but he was basically like, oh yeah, none of these Hermetic texts looks that old. They're all using words. It's Koine Greek. Koine Greek's not that old, you know. So we discovered that the Hermetic texts couldn't be reliably dated to a pre-Christian era, which means that Hermes Trismegistus, who up until 1614, up until 1614, Hermes Trismegistus was like the ancient sage who taught Moses. And then all of a sudden it's like, he's post-Jesus. He's just another pagan trying to rip off the Christians. And so the Hermetic texts kind of started to lose their steam, and Hermeticism, which had been sort of slowly working its way into becoming like sort of a mainstream accepted influence on the Christian church, instead went in the other direction and became obscure. I forgot to bring water this time. Yeah, do you have glasses of water? But Hermeticism, and especially because of its influence on so many Renaissance occultists and Renaissance philosophers and alchemists and all this sort of stuff, it did continue to be very influential on esoteric traditions in the West and the development of secret societies in the West. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Actually, we're going to talk about it in the next slide. It'll be less than a little bit. And we'll talk about it in a sec. Thank you, Steve. All right. All right, so modern Hermeticism. And when I say modern, I mean like 1800 on. Hermetic, the word Hermetic got really, really mixed up, probably because it ended up being combined with so many things during the Renaissance. And there was probably like 100, 150 year period where the meaning of Hermetic was so diluted that it kind of was frequently used to mean things are magical or esoteric or occult. And it kind of stopped meaning Hermetic as in related to this philosophy, religion around Hermes Trismegistus. So it's kind of difficult to separate, finger quote Hermetic from real Hermetic. And that's something that that hopefully you'll be able to do more now that you've seen what Hermeticism was actually about and continues to be about. So probably the most famous use of the word Hermetic is the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Is it Hermetic? I will say, maybe a little bit. It's definitely incredibly influential. It was founded in 1880s. It took Hermeticism, or the Hermeticism that it had available to it, and mixed it with everything it possibly could. It's through the Golden Dawn that we get like Hermetic Kabbalah, that we get stuff like the existence of the Hermetic Tarot, that we get Hermetic stuff mixed into ceremonial magic. They kind of adopted Hermetic principles without really fully committing to them. But they emphasized more the practical magic over the theurgic sort of magic. But I mean, we wouldn't have any modern occultism without the Golden Dawn sort of coming in and bringing grimoires out of the dust and enshrining all of these things in books that have been so influential and important. So I will say that there might be something in the Golden Dawn that has a strong Hermetic core, but it has so much other stuff piled on top of it that it's really hard to see it as a Hermetic order instead of a magical order. But it's probably where you will see the term Hermetic most often if you are not looking for it. Next, Franz Bardon. He was a very influential Czech occultist who wrote a book called Initiation into Hermetics. And he tried, when I say he had an approach to Hermetic magic, again, it's hard to call it really Hermetic. Franz Bardon was was very heavily influenced by the New Thought movement, and New Thought was, while it may have had Hermetic influences, was so far removed from it by the 20th century that it's almost impossible to call New Thought Hermetic at all. And so Franz Bardon's stuff, it's Hermetic in the 1800s sense of being sort of like Western magic and Western esotericism, but it isn't necessarily Hermetic in the Hermetic sense. So this is more finger quotes Hermetic. And then, of course, the Kybalion, which you open it up and it's like, this book was written by Hermes Trismegistus. And then it goes on to say all these things that Hermes Trismegistus would never have said. So it is finger quotes Hermetic, but also probably you should capitalize it when you say it. So, yeah, so no Kybalion here. But that's not to say that Hermeticism is dead, right? Like, especially in the 20th century and now into the 21st, like, we have more classical Hermetic stuff available to us than ever before. Well, except maybe if you live back then. But now you can order it off of Amazon or buy it here at Dark Star Magic. But we have so much available that while it might be impossible to accurately recreate real Hermetic practice, we can find materials from around the same period or newer materials or invent new materials that match what the Hermetica were actually telling us to do. And thankfully, people have been doing that. You know, we have lots of people going through older works, coming up with new stuff and doing things that are, you know, inspired by their work with the Corpus Hermeticum and the Hermetic texts. Some of these are Hermetic prayers, which are sort of sprinkled throughout the Hermetica. My favorite is at the end of book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum, where there's a sort of like a prayer where you kind of devote yourself to the practice of Hermeticism and trying to sort of spread wisdom and heal the world. There's meditation and contemplative practice, which can be used in to analyze texts. Like we have lots of time-tested methods for sitting with texts and analyzing them and finding deeper meanings in them, and we can use that with the Hermetica. The Hermetica do describe some initiation rituals, not well, but enough that you can kind of get ideas of what they might supposed to be, which means that you can design sort of like self-dedication or self-initiation rituals yourself. And then, of course, there is the practice of sort of like planetary magic or planetary theurgy, which is very well developed in the modern world and matches incredibly close with what Hermeticism seems to be teaching us to do. In the end, I think, though, that practicing Hermetica in the modern world is very much a do-it-yourself kind of thing. You're going to have to do some research, adapt other rituals, find what other people are doing, see what works for you, see what mixes well with what you're doing. And then, of course, it is possibly amongst the nerdiest of occult practices, so there's lots of reading involved. So here are some books. Those first 3 are translations of the Corpus Hermeticum in English. The Hermetica is the most scholarly. It has a lot of background information, tons of footnotes, and an incredible introduction that will lead you through understanding the historic context way more than I possibly could. The Way of Hermes is the one that I use the most. It's a very poetic translation, and as you can see, it's very small. So you can take it with you everywhere. If it's in any bag. Did I just? Oh. And then the Divine Pymander is the first English translation of the Corpus Hermeticum from 1650. It's it's early modern English, so it kind of is like mystical Shakespeare or something. I really like reading it. I know that it puts off a lot of people, and it's kind of a weird one. But if you ever come across the Ouroboros Press Hermetica, which you don't have it here anymore, but
I'm out of stock.
Yeah, so that's the John Everard translation. I think it's a delight to read, so that's definitely one to keep an eye on. And then when it comes to sort of getting in deeper, the Greek magical papyri in translation by Betts is a collection of magical rituals and sort of devotions and practices from across late antiquity. So it's all Coptic and Demotic and Koine Greek texts that have been, translated into English, and they're full of amazing rituals and fun practices. And some of them you can't do anymore, and some of them are really weird, but some of them are accessible and easy to use. And then Hermetica 2, which is, once you've really committed, it's the book with all of the fragments translated in it. All right, so when you're getting into this practice, like Hermeticism isn't just, the one God, right? It comes from a polytheistic culture. It involves a lot of polytheistic practice. Since the supreme deity is kind of unreachable, a lot of the work in it involves talking to lesser deities, or deities that you can pray to and burn incense for and give sacrifice to. Some of the most important ones are like the solar deities, Helios. Did I not write? Okay, so Helios and Amun-Ra are sort of like solar deities that are really important. Helios is sometimes associated with Agathos Daimon, which is Greek for the good spirit or the good God, and sort of represents the facet of the supreme being that we are able to interact with. You might see it referred to as a hypercosmic God or a hypercosmic Helios. And then, of course, Hermes and Thoth are in Hermetic traditions kind of seen as almost the same deity, kind of syncretized together. And then Hermenubis is a merger of Hermes and the Egyptian god Anubis, who ruled over the realm of the dead, or was a psychopomp. And Hermenubis is used by a lot of modern Hermeticists, or sort of venerated by modern Hermeticists. And this picture on the left is a bas-relief of Hermenubis, and then all of that strange text down there is just the Coptic letter A over and over and over again. Like, like that. He's got snakes. It's a problem. Asclepius is a god who is associated with Hermeticism primarily because he seems to show up in the Corpus Hermeticum. We don't know if it's really him or not, but he's a god of health and healing. Hygeia is his, I think, either consort or daughter, and is also sort of associated with health and healing. So they are important Hermetic deities. And then the whole set of sort of like planetary gods and spirits tend to be fairly important because of their. Oh yes, a question.
Question: Are Hermes thought that Hermenubis seen as the same or different entity than Hermes Trismegistus?
I think different. It seems to me Hermes Trismegistus never seems to be worshipped or venerated, and is sort of treated more as like a smart human, a wise human. So I think Hermes Thoth and Hermenubis are considered gods apart from Hermes Trismegistus. But again, there's nothing that really makes that super clear. It's not like the text spells it out. But they don't feel the same to me. That's for sure.
One thought I had with the Corpus Hermeticum and character Tot, and the Egyptian god Thoth, and spelled out in Egyptian is T-A-H-T, which is where we get Tuti, Tot.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that the synchronized kind of
I think that there's a possibility of that.
Tahuti, or the Egyptian god Thoth, with the son of Hermes Trismegistus.
Yeah, which would be weird. But that could be. It could be. Well, it could be that like Thoth from the Egyptian pantheon and then Asclepius from the Greek side were both pulled in as Hermes Trismegistus' students. Like maybe that would make sense. I'm not really sure. I do know that once I got into an argument or a very weird miscommunication and misunderstanding with somebody when we were talking about the Corpus Hermeticum, and he just kept insisting over and over and over again that that Thoth was in the Corpus Hermeticum. I was like, he's in every chapter. I'm like, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. And we went back and forth and back and forth, and I like pulled it out, and I'm like, find it. And he's like, oh, I mean, I've never read it. I've only listened to it on audiobook.
Another question: does the Roman Mercury and the planet while we're at it factor?
Absolutely, they do. Mercury and Hermes are syncretized together over and over and over again, to the point where I'm not really sure that it makes much sense in the modern world to draw a distinction between them. So they are definitely together. The connection between like the planetary gods and these gods and other senses, it's a different one. It takes a lot. Yeah, I'd say they're the same. I'd say Hermes and Mercury and the planet Mercury are probably very, very close, if not entirely the same. So anyhow, so these are sort of some of the deities you would work with, but there are others. There's another text that's sort of kind of Hermetic, but maybe not all the way Hermetic, called the Kore Cosmo, or Divine Virgin, and or the Cosmic Virgin, I guess. And it has like a ton of Egyptian and Greek gods all like hanging out and working on problems together, including Isis, and I think Anubis is in there, and there's a lot going on in that book, but it might not be entirely Hermetic. So, you know, again, a lot of it is sort of do it yourself, but you know, the puzzle pieces don't always match. You kind of smash them together. A really good place to go for rituals to use with Hermeticism is the Greek magical papyri, the PGM. This is like, if you like occult stuff and you like weird magic and you want to read some crazy ass stuff that's filled with magical things, you owe yourself this book. Santa Claus should bring it to you this year. It's like every page you open up to, there's something strange going on. Weird gods being invoked, weird incenses and mixtures being done, weird long lists of strange barbarous names, and just all this great stuff. I think the one ritual that I use out of this the most often is the invocation to Helios / Agathos Daimon, from PGM 36, lines 211 to 30. And it's a really short little prayer that you're supposed to basically, like, you anoint yourself, face the sun, and recite it 7 times. And I use it sort of like every Sunday. It's like my Sunday prayer. There are invocations to Hermes in here. There are magical rituals that you might find really familiar because they've been adopted by other traditions. Probably the most famous being the Bornless Rite, or the Bornless Ritual, which is called the Stele of Jew in the PGM, and was, I think, famously adopted by Crowley in I don't remember, Liber Samek, that's right. But it's also, you'll find it in other contexts too. It's a pretty well-known ritual. There are rituals that involve sort of like prayers to the stars, ascending through the spheres, contacting your personal daimon. You're like basically the prototype for the holy guardian angel. Like, everything is in here. So PGM, go get it. It's good for you.
Question again: is the Divine Virgin referring to Mary?
Heck no. No, definitely not. I don't think there's any Christian influence in that book at all. It's no. Good question though. I'm sorry that I laughed. I should have just answered. Okay.
The name being Cora, it could be a connection to Persephone.
That's, I think, probably more likely, is that it's connected to Persephone. Yeah. Okay. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Another really good place to go for probably like the simplest start to practicing Hermeticism as a magical practice are works that help align you kind of with the passage of time and the movement of the stars and the movement of the planets and stuff. So daily planetary prayers are a really good way to do this. A lot of people use the Orphic hymns. It's a really easy way to start. Andrew B. Watt, who's a modern writer, has been inspired to write a bunch of these sort of planetary hymns himself. You can go on his website and get a copy of his stuff. Or you can write your own, like as Andrew has demonstrated. If you feel divinely inspired and the spirit moves you, write some poems, use them as hymns. So theurgy, which I've mentioned a number of times, is one of the sort of core components of Hermetic practice. And unfortunately, the Hermetica don't give us a lot of technical information on how to practice theurgy. But luckily, we have lots of super smart, amazing scholars who have worked on this stuff already for us. I think one really good way to start, though, is, as I was mentioning before, sitting with the Hermetica, like reading portions of it, trying to figure out what it means, doing contemplation on it. Like, that's a good start. But these books, Theurgy and Theory and Practice by P.D. Newman, Living Through Theurgy by Jeff Cooperman, and then The Practical Art of Divine Magic, which has Theurgy and lots of other really cool stuff in it by Patrick Dunn. Those are all really good starts. And then also, as you make your way through the Hermetica, you will come across other things that it sort of urges you to do or urges you to work on. One of them that seems to be more advanced, that's talked about in the 13th book of the Corpus Hermeticum, is solidifying and increasing your virtue. It doesn't give a method for it, but it describes sort of like the emulation of sort of these divine traits and using them to overcome these celestial vices that are keeping your soul from ascending through the spheres. And virtue practice is something that has become really core to a lot of Western esoteric stuff. So we have systems that do this now that you can adapt and use alongside Hermeticism. Musar is a system of esoteric ethics and virtue that comes from Judaism. Freemasonry has a virtue practice built into it, but there are others out there, like ways of sort of like improving your soul through being better, through practicing sort of like the public virtues. Like that's a very important Hermetic practice. The art of memory probably wasn't Hermetic in the beginning, but through the Renaissance, as memory became seen as more of an esoteric and occult practice, the art of memory became more Hermetic. So I think that's a really good one to practice. And then, of course, astrology and alchemy, as long as you don't blow yourself up with your weird alchemy lab, is a good Hermetic practice. So that's I hope I didn't go through that too fast, but that's my talk. Thank you. I am very eager to answer more questions.
Okay. One thing I'm wondering about is, do you have any knowledge about how the Hermetic definitions got to Armenia?
I don't think anybody does. I was reading the introduction to it, and it's sort of like, oh yeah, somebody found these. They were in Armenian.
There's got to be a story there.
I know. But I don't know it. They're old, so, and I don't know how old Armenian is. I mean, no language is infinite old. Yes.
My audio cut out when you were telling the story of the Haran pagans in the Islamic army.
Yes, I will repeat that. So I would urge you to look this up later and fact check me on it. But the legend goes, or the myth goes, that so the Islamic army during their original sort of like jihad across the Middle East and Europe were pretty brutal, and they were sort of like convert or die sort of thing. And when they got to Haran, they were like, all right, everybody here has to either convert to Islam or face the sword. And the Haranians were like, oh, no. We are already people of the book. Like, and they were like, here's our book. We are associated with the these people in the Quran, I think they might have been called the Sabians, and nobody knew who the Sabians were. And so, these Islamic scholars like looked at the Hermetic stuff and they were like, looks like there's just one God. They're probably people in the book. And so Haran and the Iranian pagans were protected from the jihad because the Quran protected them.
May I?
Yes.
Sometimes giving talks myself, I know how question sessions are so often an opportunity for people to not so much ask a question as talk about what they know.
Yes.
And so I'm going to be a bad example. There was that question about how Islam might have tied into the spread of Hermeticism,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot we know about that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and that in particular there was a belief in Muslim culture at that time that that all of the different prophets, of whom Muhammad was the last and greatest,
Mm-hmm.
were reflecting wisdom that was given directly by God to humans at various times,
Right.
and that all cultures from all times had this. And so they were very interested in going around to everywhere and across all history
Mm-hmm.
to find the sources of that primordial wisdom, which in the West speaking known as Prisia Theologica, but
Mhm.
it was Islamic culture that had that idea first.
Yes.
And that was what led them to find the Hermetic texts translated into Arabic. We do, some of the most prominent translators are known by name. I don't know
Mhm.
them, but some of the prominent places where they were translated were Basra, and
Mhm.
then it was especially centered in Baghdad.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. But I think we also need to remember that there are centuries between the original Islamic jihad and then the Arabic world going out to preserve all this knowledge, right? So when they were originally being violent, it wasn't at the same time. That was a couple hundred years before they were like, okay, now let's go do all the translations.
True, but that was
Yeah.
just an answer to that
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Well, one other thing that that variation of Islam known as Ismailianism that developed an independent caliphate in Egypt, they were especially fascinated by Hermeticism and probably propagated a lot of interest in Hermeticism across that part of the world.
Yeah.
And integrated legends about Jewish legends of Enoch with Hermes, because
Mhm.
for them Idris, the Arabic Idris, was both Enoch and Hermes,
Right.
and
Yes.
they propagated that whole aspect of the religion in Ismailianism.
Yeah, for sure. Which is definitely I don't know a whole lot about that portion of the history, but I've read that too. Which I think is fascinating.
There's a book called The Arabic Hermes.
It's true. It's
That is-
expensive.
But it's wonderful.
I know. It's on my list. I'll get it one of these days. Are there any more questions for anybody in here? Any more online questions? Okay.
So I've been kind of doing my research on Hermeticism for a little while.
Uh-huh.
I think that something I'm curious about is if there are any active groups that actively utilize these ideas and practice together. I know about
Yes.
the Institute of Hermetic Studies out in Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
They're pretty active, but yeah, I'd love to know more about that.
There aren't a lot, and they tend to be pretty few and far between. But there is one in Portland. We have Hermetic Lodge in Portland does Hermetic rituals like once a month. You'll find them. They're rare.
What is the one here called?
Hermetic Lodge. We have no website.
How about you
But-
get in contact?
I can get you in contact with them for sure.
Okay, well, one last question from
Okay.
me. Do you have anything that you could say about the crater or mixing bowl?
Mm-mm.
Fair enough.
I don't have anything off the top of my head. It's one of those things it's one of those images that never it never really sat with me very solidly, but I love coming across that page in Everard's translation. Where it's like the crater of Hermes. And you're like, what? It's a bowl. Yes.
Is the thing about ensoling statues related to golem creation?
I will give that a qualified yes. I mean, we have rituals in the PGM about that talk about the process of ensoling statues. But golem creation, I think, is only similar in theme and not necessarily in practice, what I would say.
True.
Yeah. That is a good question, though, and it's one of those things that's definitely worth looking into. It's hard to find golem creation rituals. They're very rare and probably still mostly in Hebrew manuscript form. But there's a theory that the Sefer Yetzirah is used to create golems. I've seen a golem ritual in one or two different books before, but it's not exactly the same as ensoling a statue. Yeah. All right. I think that's it. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, online people. Thanks for being here. And I will hang up.